And we're back with a Moonkin monthly. For those who don't know, this channel primarily started out as me talking about Balance Druid about once every couple of weeks, once a month, something like that. And now with the new expansion really starting to ramp up with the War Within and me getting my hands on the new Balance Druid in a realistic way and being able to kind of play through it inside of M plus dungeons and getting a bit more data, seeing some performance and raid testing of the spec, I'm able to, I think, articulate my thoughts on balance a bit more. I think it's always very difficult to give really good thoughts whenever you're not actually testing the spec inside of M plus dungeons or testing it inside of like raid testing. I think that whenever you're doing like normal and heroic dungeons and then just kind of hitting dummies, like you can give some feedback, but I don't think it's always going to be the greatest feedback. And so with the past couple of weeks, we've had some M plus testing, and I've had a decent amount of time to play the spec. I think that now is a good time to kind of talk about my thoughts on it. And I think that Faulty, on behalf of the Balance Druid theory crafting community, on behalf of the Dream Grove, wrote a pretty good write-up in terms of what Balance Druids are kind of experiencing for 11.0. Are these things likely to be implemented and changed come 11.0? No, but does it going to stop me from wanting to talk about them and hope that some things will actually get made to make the spec more positive coming into 11.0? Yes. And so that's why I think it's actually kind of important to read through this post and kind of talk about what I'm thinking about balance and then kind of what the community's sentiment on the spec are currently. First and foremost, Faulty starts with, as we approach the new expansion, Balance Druid is receiving 2 new hero talent trees and a number of big changes to the spec. After having spent a good bit of time testing, we were going to examine whether or not they met Blizzard's stated goals for the spec, because Blizzard, coming into whenever they were like launching all the specs, they kind of did some changes to the specialization just in general. Probably one of the biggest things is honestly the removal of pulsar. They changed that to where now it's only just a choice node with greater alignment and orbital strike, where greater alignment now has a duration of incarnation, as opposed to you like proccing pulsar and having a decently high amount of incarnation uptime. So Blizzard's stated design goals: remove pulsar. Pulsar, despite its powerful damage buff and eclipse effects, constrained Balance Druid's rotation and damage alignment due to its 40 to 45 second cadence. Additionally, they stated pulsar punished downtime or intermission phases too heavily. The other thing is talent variety and increased build / playstyle variety by freeing up talent points and reducing the power of required talents. They also aim to add new talents that allow us to specialize in different damage types, such as dots, builders, or finishers. So with these stated design goals, I'm going to start with pulsar. I will say first and foremost, additionally they stated pulsar punished our downtime, our intermission phases too heavily. I guess that's technically true, but in general, I don't think that that's exactly correct, more so because of the fact that like you never actually lost your pulsar. And so since pulsar had like infinite duration, like there was never actually real issues with downtime. There was going to be some bosses that actually went to immune where you could actually still generate up your pulsar. And so in that regard, it was actually kind of interesting. I will say that it definitely did restrain Balance Druid's damage alignment and timing due to the cadence. And honestly, it was a little bit too strong. It was so strong to the point where we actually couldn't necessarily play any other talent. It was kind of like Celestial Alignment in that regard, where you were just kind of like forced to talent it because you were going to be giving up too much if you didn't. And so I think that the removal of pulsar does make sense in isolation. I think that it was a bit too dominant in the design space. We've had it for a few expansions now, and so removal of it, assuming that they make good changes to fill in the gaps that pulsar actually provided in terms of complexity and diversity across the spec, I think that removal of pulsar is probably a good thing in the long run. For talent variety, they wanted to create new builds and playstyle variety by freeing up talent points and reducing the power of required talents. They also added new talents that let us specialize in different damage types. And I think that whenever they said that, they were talking about things such as like stellar amplification, where Star Surge increases the damage that your target takes from periodic effects. There was also things like Umbral Inspiration, where consuming your Umbral Embrace will increase the damage of your Moonfire, Sunfire, Stellar Flare, Shooting Stars, and Starfall. There was also things such as Harmony of the Heavens, which is the Emergency 4 set, where Star Surge or Starfall increases your current Eclipse, Arcane, or Nature damage bonus. There's also Touch of the Cosmos, which is a very similar effect to Starweaver, where casting Wrathen and Eclipse has an 8% chance to make your next Star Surge free. In addition to that, casting Starfire and Eclipse has a 10% chance to make your next Starfall free. So those were the kind of the things that they were looking to do in regards to creating new variety and free up talent points. Now, I will say that there's a lot of 2-point nodes in our tree, and what Blizzard does whenever they rework specializations in general is they just remove 2-point nodes and remove all of the friction inside of a tree, and that, while it does open up a lot of build variety, that just completely removes all the friction in the tree. Balance Druid could probably be good with this. We have Umbral Intensity as a 2-point node, we have Astral Smaller as a 2-point node, Rapidity, Balance of All Things, Goldrin, and Starlord, all 2-point nodes. So we have a lot compared to some of the other specializations that have 0 now. But I will say that even with the 2-point nodes kind of constraining our builds, I will say that I don't think that they said that they aim to add new talents that allow us to specialize in different things, and I do not believe that they hit that at all. I feel like no matter what talents I talent, the specialization still feels very similar in almost all aspects. There are some elements where it might feel a little bit different, but in general, it feels very similar across any different build, any different play style, where, by and large, you're just going to be playing that builder spender play style. There's not going to be any significant gameplay changes in any meaningful capacity. So key changes in community feedback. I'll just read through this and I'll kind of give my thoughts. Removal Pulsar. While removing Pulsar is welcome due to the constraints noted by Blizzard, and its absence with compensatory gameplay additions feels negative, Pulsar was integral to the spec's core feel and gameplay, unlike Rune of Power for mages, and it wasn't just a constraint, but also one of the last things that added depth to the spec. Yeah, so whenever Pulsar got removed, so I'm logged into beta right now, whenever Pulsar got removed, it's actually fine that it got removed, but something that I will say is that the spec feels a lot more boring now without Pulsar. You're actually generating a decent amount of astral power with both the hero talent trees, but whenever you're actually building this astral power, your spenders don't feel powerful enough, but then Pulsar, on the back end, actually allowed your spenders to feel very powerful because you were always kind of building towards something, right? You're building towards your next Pulsar proc. And in a world where you're actually not playing, so say you're playing Rattle of the Stars instead of Starweaver, which it looks like you might due to tuning, there's kind of this absence of oh, what am I actually generating all of this astral power for? Because whenever you're generating a lot of astral power, you're going to get a lot of Starweaver and procs. You're going to be able to spend on a lot of Starfalls. You'll be able to spend on a lot of Star Surges. But just those spenders alone don't create a satisfying enough gameplay loop to where you're super happy about it. And so while the removal of Pulsar in isolation, very good, it allows us to really open up our tree and allows us to do a lot more stuff. I think that, it wasn't just a constraint, but also one of the last things that added depth to the spec. I think that the spec became a lot more boring whenever Pulsar got removed. The Pulsar replacement, Greater Alignment, and Orbital Strike, the two new choice nodes that offer flexibility between 2-minute burstier and a 3-minute more powerful / longer cooldown. This will create an interesting choice / build diversity, but will also come down to proper tuning. As it currently stands, we don't really have numbers on this, so I can't really speak to it too terribly much. But yeah, it kind of comes down to proper tuning as to how interesting the decision making between Greater Alignment and Orbital Strike will end up being. I will say that based on feel, Orbital Strike should in theory be burstier, but it's not. And while, the longer incarnation should in theory feel like a powerful cooldown inside of your CDs itself, it also doesn't. That's mostly due to the fact that, first off, Orbital Strike doesn't do a ton of damage whenever you press it. It's actually a very low contribution amount, just in general across, look at this. This is from an entire dungeon run where Orbital Strike was only about 2.5% of my damage. And so it doesn't actually feel that bursty. Whenever you press it on a trash pack or on a boss or whatever, you're not actually nuking. It doesn't feel that powerful, right? There's just a disconnect in terms of how it feels. On top of that, longer cooldowns, while they can feel good, Incarnation hasn't ever felt like a super powerful cooldown in isolation. And that's due to the fact that it's been artificially reduced in power because Pulsar was always so strong. So our Incarn was typically very weak. And so now without Pulsar being in play and Incarn being fairly weak, I don't feel like they actually achieved their goal with this. Blizzard also noted their intention to make these cooldowns more powerful but shorter in duration. This tuning has yet to be implemented, but it would be a welcome change. Yeah, I think that's perfectly stated. I 100% agree with that. Talent diversity issues. The existence of numerous 2-point talent nodes and passive talents is what significantly restricts build varieties. Specifically, the 6 remaining 2-point nodes and their position hinder our ability to take some of the more interesting talents, leaving little room for meaningful decisions. There's also 15 passive talents that with a minimal impact on gameplay, which make the spec feel overly simplistic. Removing such reworking talents like Pulsar, Rattle the Stars, which was the rattle that we had in Season 1, changing interactions with Stellar Flare and how they worked with shooting stars and Orbit Breaker and stuff like that, and then replacing them with purely passive talents has reduced the gameplay depth. Talents that add passive buffs to dots, generators, or spenders typically do not change our gameplay loop or add to it. We'll still want to keep up dots, generate AP, and spend it. Talents like Star-Lord, Balance of All Things, Fury of Elune, New Moon, Starweaver are examples of things that are either procs or passives that do add some depth or are active buttons to manage. And right as it currently stands, the only thing that we're actually tracking is going to be looking to be like Starweaver and making sure that you're pressing like your Fury of Elune and Moons on CD. I think that this bottom part is kind of what I was trying to say earlier with like Pulsar and the complexity and the skill ceiling being reduced so heavily to where it feels very bland. And I think that's the problem with the spec just as a whole for me right now, is that it feels very bland and very static, where, you know, I'm going to dot mobs regardless of whether or not I'm taking talents that increase the damage that my, you know, abilities take from periodic effects. I'm still going to dot the mobs. My generators, even if my generators are stronger, am I going to notice that unless I'm like really, really scouring the damage meter? No, I'm not going to notice that. It's not changing my playstyle, right? I'm never going to forego using a spender on behalf of a generator. And even if I did, that would suck. I would have massive negative feedback on that. And then our spenders typically don't change our gameplay loop or add to it. And so things that, you know, I would say like Rattle the Stars, the current version of Rattle, where it's Star Surge and Starfall just deal 12% increased damage and their costs are reduced by 10%. You don't notice any difference in feel for how that feels to press, right? You're going to notice the cost reduction, but in terms of how it feels to press or the gameplay loop, what you're doing is fundamentally you're just pressing your dots, you're building to that astral power threshold to where you're able to press a spinner, then you just press your spinner. And that's kind of the gameplay loop you just follow. And there's some minor things, and I think that Star-Lord's the only one that we kind of work around right now, but the rest of them you don't actually work around. And so more active buttons to press could potentially solve this, but in addition to that, better passive proc-based stuff could also be very cool to be able to resolve this a little bit. I think that like the Season 1 Dragonflight bonus, a lot of the reason that people wanted that back is because it felt so satisfying whenever you would proc Eclipse and then you'd have that free spender. And then like being able to chain free spenders with like Starweaver, that felt like that was a really cool gameplay loop, right? And I think that was like a really satisfying way of playing the specialization. And on top of that, you were still building towards that Pulsar. Astral Power generation. While this comes down to tuning, it should be noted that the reductions in AP generation are generally not satisfying. Hero talents seem to help offset this a bit, but the spec is generally more fun when resource generation is high. I think that our AP gen baseline is kind of okay right now. This might be a controversial opinion amongst the community, but I think that the amount of AP generation that we have, whenever you're combining it with the hero talent AP generation, seems like it feels okay to me. Now the issue, like at least that I have right now, is the fact that there's like a bunch of like other garbage with the hero talents that I find very unsatisfying. But I think in terms of like how much astral power we have to generate, it feels okay. But like the spenders just conversely don't feel that great to press because we don't actually have a lot of depth to the spec, right? Where the spenders should be the fun part of the specialization. They should feel very satisfying to press, and they just don't feel as satisfying to press as they reasonably should. And I think that that's maybe the issue with this right here. For hero talent specifically, increased AP generation. Oh, Elune's chosen. Increased AP generation and CDR interactions have been very fun to play with, but the visuals are lacking a bit. Yeah, I would agree with the VFX for Elune's chosen is maybe a little bit lacking. I think the multiplicative, like the moon proc, is kind of cool, but I think in general, you know, something that's a lot cooler with the Fury of Elune, like explosion animation, that would be sick. I think that there's a lot of VFX stuff that they could utilize in the Elune's chosen tree that would make it feel a lot cooler and a lot more satisfying. For Lunar Calling, feels restrictive and bland, especially single-target situations due to lower AP generation / higher cast time on Starfire. Yeah, so Lunar Calling is actually just a really bad talent in general. So numerically, and I don't have numbers on a lot of different stuff, but numerically, this is very difficult to make it good. Foregoing pressing Wrath on single-target situations is like nearly a death sentence damage wise. And so this is something that like I don't think is like a talent is actually very well designed. What it states is that Starfire deals 40% increased damage to its primary target, but you can no longer trigger Solar Eclipse. And this is a situation that actually doesn't happen too often. You would think, oh, okay, maybe this could be viable in Mythic Plus, but Mythic Plus, you're actually spending about 40% of your time killing bosses. And so something like Lunar Calling would be just a death sentence in a dungeon because you still have to hit bosses. Like there's very few full AoE situations with a primary target where something like that would be good. Last thing, Lunation versus Arcane Affinity. Lunation is very engaging to play with and ideally remains the pick in all situations versus the 3% damage increase of Arcane Affinity, which provides no gameplay. I think Lunation is actually probably the coolest talent in the entire part of the Elune's Chosen Tree. Your Arcane ability is reducing the cooldown of your Fury of Elune and your moons whenever you're actually pressing Arcane abilities. It feels so satisfying to play around. You're getting your Fury of Elune down to about that 25 to 30 second mark in most instances whenever you're doing like M+. And so that's a situation where it just feels very satisfying to play around whenever you're being able to chain a bunch of Fury of Elunes and press them a lot. That really feels like the Elune's Chosen Tree is like feeding into itself in a way that has a positive feedback loop, at least for me. Again, that's like probably the coolest part of all of the hero talents, though, is that Lunation and that feedback loop that you're actually being able to press a bunch of Fury of Elunes. Once you get to that second Fury of Elune on a trash pack or something like that, because you gen enough AP to like Lunation it down, that feels very satisfying. But then, you know, you still have that weird gameplay loop where the spec feels kind of bland on top of that. And so while you're generating, you know, a decent amount of astral power from these Fury of Elunes, what you're spending it on doesn't feel great. Keeper of the Grove. Dude, I've had so much negative feedback about Keeper of the Grove. I don't think that Blizzard's going to fix this, unfortunately. I really wish they would have picked a different button, man. Like, I think that there's just like a lot that's wrong with Keeper of the Grove. They did rework... what was the name of this thing? They did rework... it was previously Cenarian's Might. It was previously named Cenarian's Might, now it's called Control the Dream. So that's good that they reworked it. Now it's time elapsed while your major cooldowns are available to be used as subtracted. Oh, okay, never mind. Cenarius Might actually got reworked to being entering Eclipse increases your haste by 8% for 6 seconds, which is fine. But it's completely passive, right? There's no gameplay with that. You see the continuing trend here. There's no gameplay with just I get haste. Okay, cool. Thematically, this tree doesn't really resonate with the Balance Druid community overall, it seems. Making the Fawn model change into Big Ancients would at least make them look/feel cool to press. I think that actually tackling VFX on a lot of these hero talents is something that would make it more satisfying. If I was actually summoning big-ass Ancients, say I summon Gnarl Root, that would be cool, right? I actually don't think that trees and Fawn in isolation is uncool. I think that, like, what's wrong with our... First and foremost, it's just really hard to talent trees, especially if you're going into M+ situations. So because like having Starfall talented at the top of the tree, you're going to end up talenting Ethereal Kindling because of that too. So these are like 2 points that whenever you're looking to do AoE, they just are always talented. So then you're going to end up taking a point from the bottom of the tree to talent into Force of Nature. And I think that while VFX could actually make this feel a lot more satisfying to press, there is an issue with the button itself where Force of Nature just isn't designed in a way that is like super popular or people don't feel like great about the button. More so also due to the fact that Force of Nature in isolation on its own isn't a satisfying button to press. Kind of similar to Warrior of Elune. It's just there's not a lot going on with the button. And so that's kind of where people are coming from with that. Where it's like thematically it's not that cool. People kind of wish that it was this entire tree would be based around like mushrooms or something like that, right? That ties in with both Restoration's Efflorescence and then Balance Druid's wild mushrooms. That could have been a lot cooler, right? Where this would have ended up being a lot more interesting of a tree if it was based around mushrooms in some capacity. Also, selecting Keeper puts further constraints on the spec tree, as we now have to sacrifice a point at the bottom of the half of the tree to take Force of Nature in the top, assuming a situation where you also take Starfall. Whenever you don't take Starfall, this is not necessarily an issue, but whenever you take Starfall, so say any situation where you have 2 targets or more, this is a problem. Additionally, the gameplay focus of this tree being largely related to builders don't offer much depth whatsoever, as discussed previously. Treants as a whole don't feel like a fun button to press either. It's bland. I mean, that's the issue with it, right? Is that it's bland. Eclipse system. The Eclipse system overall has become uninteresting and overly maintenance focused. Previous changes allowing you to control which Eclipse you enter alleviated some of these issues, but highlighted the systemic problems. The constraints and focus the system places on entering/leaving Eclipse doesn't feel any impactful anymore. After numerous band-aid fixes, this feels like a system that has outlived its usefulness. Yeah, this is like a problem that they had with like Wrath of the Lich King's Eclipse, and then they changed it going into like Cataclysm and Mop. That's why they changed the Eclipse system going into Cataclysm and Mop. And those Eclipse systems weren't perfect by any means, but this is why they changed them, right? It's because it just feels very unsatisfying. It becomes uninteresting and overly maintenance focused. You know, you end up having these procs that are focused on leaving Eclipse or entering Eclipse, and it's just like the Eclipse system itself feels like it's something that's like stitched together right on top of like the core of what balance is, right? It's like a secondary resource that doesn't feel that good, right? And then whenever it doesn't feel that good due to talents that don't interact with it that well, I think that there's maybe a problem there. I think a lot of it too is that it just purely focuses on our builders, where the Eclipse system just doesn't do anything for our spenders, just at all asterisk, but like it doesn't do enough to where it feels impactful. And I agree, it feels like it's outlived its usefulness. I don't think that this is something that's likely to change in 11.0. I think this is like Blizzard would never do something like this with 2 months notice. But this is something that maybe we can get enough feedback in for them to change it in 12.0, which in my opinion, kind of unacceptable, but like whatever. Mastery changes / secondary scaling. Reductions in mastery value and crit scaling through astral smolder changes are concerning, as they may impede scaling through the expansion, increasing the reliance on periodic buffs to remain competitive. I don't have any thoughts on this. I think that this is just speculation at this point. I think in regards to remaining competitive and having increased reliance on periodic buffs, like, okay, yeah, maybe. Like if that's true, if that's true, then yeah, they can just buff us, right? Defensive creep / squishiness. Balance Druids become significantly squishier relative to other specs who have more powerful and numerous defensive options. Shifting into bear form frequently for survivability is punitive and unenjoyable. Yeah, the class tree. So the class tree actually got a bit of a rework too. And it's better for Resto Druid, but it's just as bad for balance as it was in the past, where you're very, very restricted. Well-honed Instinct's not a very strong node. We have a bunch of really bad nodes just in general for survivability, on top of the fact that all of our survivability is based around going into bear form. We also got another node for defensive value, but its stamina in bear form is increased by 10%, which funnily enough works with Earth Sign Vigor, where it's like, I'm still more reliant on going into bear form for small to medium hits, right? Like reliance on bark skin isn't enough in a lot of aspects, especially whenever Blizzard has so many one-shots where you're just going to be super reliant on pressing bear form and utilizing that button. It feels pretty bad. On top of that, anytime where you actually need to take Remove Corruption or Hibernate, you end up having to start giving up a lot, right? It's going to be very difficult to take like Soothe in that regard. At some point, you're actually going to start talenting out of Vigil. I haven't been able to talent Stampeding Roar the entire time that I've played on the beta. There's a lot of really bad restrictions in terms of the class tree, where basically no other class that I've ever played has had restrictions in their class tree except for Druid. And I think that a lot of it comes down to the fact that you end up having to talent so much shit that should probably be baseline, right? Where Star Surge, Starfire, Sunfire spreading, like that shit could all be baseline for balance, and then you talent into the other stuff. Whereas Frenzy Region could be balanced for all the could be baseline for all the classes. Iron Fur could be baseline for all the classes. Rake could be baseline for all the classes. Thrash could be baseline for all the classes. Rejuve could be baseline for all the classes. Wild Growth could be baseline for all the classes. And these are things that were baseline in the past, and that makes our fucking class tree just so annoying to path through, and still really annoying. And on top of that, our spec is just very squishy. Like, it is what it is. We don't really have strong passive nodes. We're completely reliant on bear form to actually mitigate any damage, and that sucks. I don't like it. The defensive creep in this game is a bit tough, and so then whenever I log on my mage, I have 6 defensive buttons to press, and I can press literally anything, and I get sometimes actually paralyzed by how many options I have, because I have so many choices of things to press. And then on my druid, I have like nothing, so it really feels shitty in that regard. Summary. Positive changes. Removal of pulsar to open up room for other gameplay loops and talents. Introduction of a few talent choices and interesting hero tree in the chosen Elune. Yeah, I actually agree. Elune's chosen. I think very interesting hero talent tree. I think that if this is the hero talent tree that we were playing, I will be happy. If I have to play Keeper of the Grove, I will be pretty upset. I don't think that trees are very fun. Introduction of a few new talent choices. I think that these talent choices are fine, but I don't think that they're interesting enough. Touch of the Cosmos is still currently bugged with like Starweaver, and it also doesn't proc enough, is something that I've noticed, where it's like an 8% chance to make your next Star Search free whenever you're pressing Wrath, it just doesn't, you don't feel like you're getting enough. Same with like Starfall, whenever you're pressing Starfire, like you don't feel like you're just like proccing it enough. And so I don't think that the new talents that they've added create anything that's like super interesting, even though I think that this is probably the best talent node that they added is Touch the Cosmos. That one's kind of cool. Removal Pulsar to open up for other gameplay loops and talents. Yeah, I agree. I think this is correct, but I think that they should have done a bit more in regards to having us do interesting decisions. Negative aspects: lack of depth following Pulsar, removal / other changes during Dragonflight. Yes, I think the changes that they made in Dragonflight to try to simplify down the spec at the time could have made sense in isolation, but then whenever you start doing it over and over and over and over and over again, then you start really feeling like you're playing a spec that is a shell of its former self, without a lot of depth and without a lot of cool decision making. Continue reliance on restricted 2-point nodes. Yeah. Basically no other class has this issue anymore with 2-point nodes. I would like to see those stripped out for balance and make, honestly, more talents. I think that more talents would probably be pretty nice in that regard. There's also excessive passive talents without depth, minimal defensive capabilities. The Keeper of the Grove Tree, the entire Keeper of the Grove Tree is a negative aspect, and an uninteresting Eclipse system. I think the only thing here that's maybe off the table for Blizzard to fix is the Eclipse system. I think that I think they should fix it, but I don't think that they will, just being very candid. Action items. Tuning adjustments to ensure new talent choices are balanced to offer real gameplay and diversity. Yeah. Right now there's a lot of talents that just are completely dead on arrival. Like Stellar Command is just completely dead on arrival. There's a bunch of other stuff. Convoke is still completely dead. Astral Communion's completely dead, just complete trash talent, stuff like that. It's just like, all right. Review and reduce 2-point nodes. Continued reduction of the number of 2-point talent nodes to enhance build flexibility. Yeah. That's how you create actual build flexibility, is you have less complete restriction in the tree. I would actually like to see less complete restriction in the tree in the top half of the tree. This top section is 100% restricted. Anytime that you have to take Starfall, you have no other options as to like what you're taking in the tree. And that's kind of why Keeper of the Grove also feels a little bit bad, because you are forced to give up something that's later on in the tree because you're forced to take this stuff at the top. Revamp passive talents, introduce more interactive talents to replace the old passive ones. And this isn't just, okay, so like Nature's Grace is also an example of this, where it's completely passive node. Balance of all things, you're never actually playing around boat, even though in theory you could. Harmony of the Heavens, you're never actively playing around dealing more damage at the end of your Eclipse, even though you're building up to it. Like, you're never actively playing around it. So there's just like a lack of depth in regards to our passive talents, and just add more functionality for things that we should be doing, right? And it's not like something that, we shouldn't have like Legion Aflock, where I'm like tracking Empowered Life Tap and then like tracking a bunch of other garbage, right? Or it's a bunch of garbage maintenance buffs, but make it feel like satisfying stuff that I'm tracking. Whenever I track it properly, I'm just like really cooking. I don't like Star-Lord canceling either. Like, I feel like that shit is just like complete nonsense. But that's like the only depth that we have right now, is like Star-Lord min-maxing and canceling. The Eclipse system overhaul. Consider a more engaging system to replace the current Eclipse mechanic. Could be down for the Mop Eclipse system. That would be kind of cool. That would be kind of cool if we had the Mop Eclipse system. That would add the depth that we're hoping for. Because right now, my biggest complaint is that the gameplay of the spec is pretty bland. It's kind of undertuned. That's not necessarily in the scope of this video. The tuning can always happen. But I think that the biggest issue right now is that the spec is very bland, especially after the removal of Pulsar. That's very, very apparent that it's a shell. It doesn't feel as bad as it did in BFA. Is what I will say. BFA was like the low point for balance by like a significant amount. I thought that there were some points in Shadowlands that felt pretty unsatisfying for me personally in regards to the spec. But I think that BFA was definitely the biggest low point. I think that we're definitely on the up and up in that regard, but I don't think that this is like great. I think that, especially with the hero talents, I'm pretty uninterested. And I think that they kind of missed the mark. I play other specs, and I've been playing a lot of other stuff. dude, the Warlock hero talents are so cool. The Mage, well, I've been playing Fire Mage. I get Sun Fury and Sun Fury Mage, I think, is actually one of the coolest hero talents as well. Kind of like similar like Diabolist and Hellcaller Warlock. And I think all the Warlock ones are sick. I think both of the AUG ones that I played with Chrono Warden and Scale Commander are both bangers as well. And so then having like pretty boring hero talents, like compared to those, it feels pretty bad. I appreciate you taking the time to read and consider the feedback presented. We are looking forward to changes in store for Balance Druid as we get ready for the War Within. Side note, there's also a major concern when playing Keeper of the Grove, as it's close to damage neutral, only spam Wrath after stacking 3 Star-Lords on single target, even after capping Astral Power. This is obviously not an intended gameplay loop. Yeah, so I have Sims on that. Yeah, it's a bit close, where you're only surging for Star-Lord, no Goldrinn, right? Where you're... It's that's pretty bad. I think that's something that could be changed with tuning. The result of this is obviously too many talents that end up buffing our generators within the spec, and the Keeper of the Grove spec. So like, there's a lot that's like wrong with that specifically, where it's like, oh, foregoing your spenders. That sounds like a really, really good gameplay loop. That would be satisfying. Anyhow, I don't want this to drag out any longer. I already ran this over 30 minutes. Goodbye, everybody. So long. I'll also link this down in the comment section as well. Go reply to this and say that you appreciate the feedback posted by Faulty here. And we'll be out of here. Goodbye.